I saw a dogman while cosplaying a werewolf. Go away, kid. Are these stories real? Please, you tell us. What I mean is, did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Welcome to Scary Stories NYC's October is Here 2-hour celebration of Dogman. I'm your old pal Bigfoot. You know, October is the only time of year that I actually like wearing a mask. Although this particular October is one in which the environment we live in is going to try to stress us all out, with politics and budgets and the so many things we all have to deal with, both publicly and personally. I hope we still find time to remember to enjoy our Halloween month. Don't let them rob your memories of Halloween 2020. You find a way to make it fun for you. Try to keep in mind all the Halloweens you've already lived through, and let the nostalgia of the season lift you out of sadness and keep you going strong. Like this guy in our first story, who tells us about his most interesting Halloween ever. That was the year in which he could make the claim. I saw a dogman while cosplaying a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a Halloween-related dogman story for you if you're in the mood for one of those. I was working as a werewolf in a Halloween haunted house that my sister still works at. I don't want to give out the name of it, as I don't want to hurt their business. I will say that it is in a slightly rural suburban area, which has been known for dogman sightings, although I didn't find that out until after my encounter. So my job in the haunted house was to wait in the backyard behind the fake tombstones they had erected. I hid behind a larger monument. Then, when people would walk by, I would jump out and go rawr. Usually they would run away. Sometimes they would erupt into nervous laughter. My costume looked pretty scary some nights, but just weird other nights. I think it might have been because of the humidity or something, but sometimes the costume was less effective, and some nights it would scare the living daylights out of people. The mask had a kind of a long snout. I think that's where the problems usually arose. When the snout was erect, I looked like a real-life werewolf. When it got damp and droopy, I looked like some sort of anteater man, which is definitely not as threatening as a werewolf. By the third night, I had begun sneaking a folding chair out there with me, and I would keep the mask off until I saw people coming from a distance. The cemetery set was out near the edge of the woods, and once I took the heavy, hot, smelly mask off, it was actually quite enjoyable to be there. I accidentally discovered a way to meditate as I would watch the leaves of the trees blowing in the wind and enjoy the sweet smell of the forest air, while focusing all my mental attention on listening for people coming behind me. The way the house was set up, they would be coming out the back door of the house to escape a zombie, and then the cemetery guide would take over for a while, showing them the way with his lantern, pointing out some humorous tombstones, and just generally allowing them to catch their breath and calm down for a bit. If he did his job right, then by the time I jumped out at them, they'd be so surprised and scared that they would willingly run to the next part of the haunted house tour back inside in a different door. Once I learned to meditate between acts, it got to be really fun. We'd reach one point every night where the customers were coming through one after the other and I would have no breaks in between, but it still seemed fun as long as I had gone into the zone enough during the first part of the evening. So one night, as I was going into my zone, I heard a noise that made me jump. That was because the sound was coming from in front of me, not from behind me. It was coming from the woods. I sat up and focused all my attention on those woods, scanning back and forth and trying to understand what that was which I had just heard. Then, I heard a branch break, and when I looked into the darkness in that direction, I swore I could see eye shine, except I mainly could see it when I wasn't looking directly at it. I couldn't really see it when I would look right there, but it was unmistakable in my peripheral vision. Whatever it was, if it was really there, it was about 7 or 8 feet off the ground. I don't really know why, but I got incredibly worried and frightened in that moment. I was scared, to be honest. At the time, I thought it was a big man out there watching me. I didn't know back then that humans don't have eye shine, so I thought it was some big scary guy. And then I heard customers bursting out of the back door screaming, and I reflexively put my big old werewolf mask back on. The guide was leading them toward me, but we were still a good while from my cue to jump out. I momentarily forgot about the eye shine in the forest and got into the rhythm of the cemetery guide's patter. When he and I performed in sync together, we could be like hard rock meets jazz improvisation. He would get them lulled into a 4/4 beat, and I would come in with a discordant note at what I hoped would be the most unlikely time possible. When it worked, it was genius, and when it didn't, it was laughably corny and pathetic. It was more fun to do it well, so I was really getting into it and getting ready for my part. Suddenly, the girls were looking in my general direction and screaming only halfway to my hiding spot. I was still hiding. They shouldn't be screaming about me. Then, something even stranger happened. The cemetery guide stared in my direction and he screamed too. That was entirely off script. I watched them all run back into the house the way they came out, which was the opposite direction they were supposed to be going in. And the cemetery guide shouldn't have been going in at all. Even if the girls had seen me, it didn't explain the behavior of the cemetery guide. Suddenly, I understood. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of something behind me. That was when I noticed that I had already noticed a really musky body odor for a while, but I had just thought it was the Wolfman mask getting moldy. I could hear what sounded like a dog panting, but way up high, like in a tree behind me, except the closest tree behind me was 20 feet away. I turned around and looked up, and the 7 or 8 foot tall dog-headed hairy man I found myself looking into the eyes of didn't like having a human stare him down. The huge black-furred canine man went from seeing me to barking in my face with his teeth right at my eye level in less than a second, and I ran backwards for maybe 10 or 15 feet before I got my balance enough to turn and run full on. I wanted to take the Dogman mask off, but I knew I couldn't do that and run at the same time, so I didn't try. As a consequence, I couldn't really see where I was going, and I tripped, and I fell hard, the anteater snout on my werewolf costume probably saving me from breaking my face. It was then that I pulled the broken mask off and ran the rest of the way inside. I went to our ready room and just took a nap. I wasn't able to go back to my spot that night, and although I did come back the night after, I didn't stay long. It was way too scary to be in that spot, where everything had happened only a night earlier. I might have been killed, and I know that. I sometimes wonder if I was meant to pass on that night. Imagine being chased by a dog man while dressed as a werewolf. Imagine if it had killed me. My friend Joe says the dog man wouldn't have killed me. He would have taken me for his wife if I hadn't taken the mask off to show him how ugly I am in real life. I know Joe's joking, but that doesn't mean he's wrong. I'm still traumatized by it in small ways even years afterward. But those first few days after were very hard for me. It took a lot of the fun out of Halloween back then. But people like hearing the story so much that it's kind of come full circle and become a fun thing to talk about each October. After all, I didn't get hurt. So It's a reason to celebrate, not to be upset and traumatized. I don't really like my sister still working at the house, but she assures me she doesn't do the cemetery part of the tour. She stays inside. I mean, the chances of something like that ever happening again are virtually non-existent, so it doesn't really matter. People should still go and enjoy the show. It's a good one. And anyway, in this part of the world, you could encounter a dogman on the way to or on the way home from this event. The way I hear it, they're everywhere for miles and miles around here. I would encourage any of you and all of you to attend this haunted house if you figured out which one I'm talking about. I'm personally going to skip it though, because I saw a dogman while cosplaying a werewolf. Today's executive producer is Avril Barkley in the UK. The UK's own Avril Barkley has decided to most starkly support the dogman from the Darkly. So pop the cork and drink the sparkly. UK's own Avril Barkley. Thank you, Avril Barkley in the UK. You're one of the few Brits we don't want independence from. And if you want to be a super cool British rock star style executive producer like the UK's own Avril Barkley, all you have to do is join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or click the join link under this or any of our videos. As soon as I wake up and check my email, I will send you links to over 9 hours of scary, uncensored dogman stories, far too something to tell on this channel. Hey, did you get the latest Windows update installed on your computer? Is that why you're watching me on your phone now instead? It seems like half of these updates cripple my computer. If I were smart, I'd switch to Linux, I guess, but I'm not smart. I'm a Bigfoot. And I'm not even a space Bigfoot either. I don't get to fly around in a spaceship. I'm just a regular Earth Bigfoot. You know, most of us these days, we rely on our computers and devices to keep us in touch with the modern world. But sometimes we don't notice what's going on right around us until we turn them off. As in the case of the Windows Update Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I love your channel, but I never really thought Dogman was an actual thing. I thought that some of your stories were people misidentifying bears or oversized canines, and that the rest were probably just made up. I still think a number of them can be explained by people seeing crazed furries running through the woods, LARPing as werewolves and dogmen. I honestly don't think that's as outlandish an idea as most people seem to think. And yet, all of my theories that left me feeling so comfortable in disbelieving in the dogman went out the window, or maybe I should say went out the windows. In short, I saw the dogman because Bill Gates and Microsoft are evil and incompetent. I guess I'm joking about the evil part, but I'm not really sure. I know that every time Windows Update turns my computer's camera off, or deletes my older programs telling me to buy new ones, I have no doubt that the man and his company are Satan himself. I'm trying to be rational here, but I don't know anyone who doesn't agree with me that Windows Update had to have been created by Damien, the son of Satan. Well, okay, I do know some people who don't feel that way. My friends who own Macs. So, the reason I'm writing to you about how I loathe this OS is that this last update jammed up my computer for so long that I actually had to go find other things to do for an entire evening and night. It somehow shut my computer down with the blue screen of death in the middle of installing its stupid updates, and so I had to try to reboot it from safe mode. At first I tried to continue the install, but that didn't work, and eventually I resorted to this hours-long uninstallation of the partially installed update, followed by multiple reboots and then an attempt to reinstall the horrid thing. Soon I realized it was after midnight, and I should either go to bed and accept another day of no computer tomorrow, or else try to stay up a little longer and see if I could fix it once and for all. While waiting for the computer to go from 7% installed to 8% installed, I sat in a comfortable chair by a window and looked at the trees and the stars and the moon. I suppose I should tell you at this point a little about where my window looks out onto. I am lucky enough to finally own my own home for the first time since my divorce 17 years ago. It's located in Wisconsin, fairly far north, but not like Canada north. You can still keep driving north from my place for some while before you leave the country or hit water or whatever, but I'm northwest of Green Bay and Oshkosh too. My backyard is a lawn and a small lake or large pond surrounded by trees, and more trees. I grew up in the country, then spent most of my adult life in and around Milwaukee, so I thoroughly enjoy being back up north surrounded by the forest. Well, most of the time I enjoy it. Obviously, this story is about the time it stopped being enjoyable for me. So I sat in my comfy chair and I looked out my window. I was hoping I might fall asleep and relieve myself of some responsibility for a few hours. But almost immediately, something outside the window caught my interest. There was something or someone in the tree line, and they seemed to be peeking out from behind a tree over at me and looking back at my window. I thought that it must be an illusion, because why would somebody be doing that? It was after midnight. I had never sat in that chair before after midnight. I had never looked out that window after midnight before either. Why would someone be there waiting to look back at me when I sat there? It was as though they were expecting me, and that just doesn't make any sense at all. So I decided it was an illusion, or my imagination, and I was satisfied that it wasn't really there. Except every time I was convinced it wasn't there, I would see it again. Finally frustrated enough that I really wanted to know what it was that I was seeing, I threw on my bathrobe and slippers, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. Then I walked right out the front door of my house, crossed back around toward the lawn, and just started marching over to where I had seen the odd shadowy movement. I knew it had to be an illusion. Something that was blowing in the breeze must have been casting the shadow of a humanoid shape, and I was imagining I was seeing something or someone there. I knew for a fact that had to be the case, and yet I had to satisfy my curiosity about what exactly was making that shadow. As I drew close to the woods, I could feel a strange vibration. I looked at my phone and it wasn't my phone vibrating. In fact, I felt it more in my feet than in my hands. Shining my phone flashlight around toward the darkness under the tree cover, I was stunned when they suddenly illuminated two very golden-colored and non-human-looking eyes. Now I saw where the vibration was coming from. It was growling, the growling of a very large forest creature whose eye shine I now had to look up in order to see. What kind of animal has yellow eyes and stands taller than a 6'2" man? Loud, sharp barking issued forth from the trees, and the phone slipped out of my hand. I ran back to the house, feeling as though my life depended on it. I looked behind me, and I saw the thing that barked at me emerging from the woods. It looked like the angriest football player in history. I don't mean soccer. I mean real football. This guy was over 7 feet tall and probably nearly as wide. He was ripped like no human, and yet he looked very human at the same time. You know it wasn't a man, though. Men don't bark. Humans don't have yellow eye shine. No, this was a dog man. There was nothing else it could be. It was some kind of a wolf, but it was also standing erect and slowly, deliberately walking toward me. I escaped into my house and slammed the door behind myself. Looking out through the window, I found the thing out there, and as I did so, it turned its massive dog head and looked directly back at me. Then, never taking its eyes off of me, I saw it melt backward into the darkness again. Like the Cheshire Cat's smile, soon all I could see of the monster was its glowing eye shine. Windows Update has officially driven me insane, I shouted to nobody at all, and I forced myself to go to bed right then and there. I didn't want to think about the possibility that any of this was really happening. I was going to choose to decide it must have been caused by me being so tired. In the morning, I woke up and I couldn't find my cell phone. I looked around until I remembered. I knew where it was, and I got a knot in my stomach. I had left it outside. The dogman had scared me, and I had dropped my phone outside before running back in. That wasn't a dream. It had actually happened. No matter how badly I want to deny it, I really did encounter the Windows Update Werewolf, the Durbin Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was driving between Frank and Durbin on the Staunton-Parkersburg Turnpike in West Virginia last month when I encountered what my friends alliteratively call the Werewolf of West Virginia, but which I think most people might call the Durbin Dogman. Now I'm going to tell you right off the bat that I am a dogman nut, and so are my two friends, but we all three of us work for one of our friends' dads, and he don't want any of us talking about anything to anybody. He says we can't talk about Dogman, but we also aren't allowed to talk about politics or celebrities or even movies or TV shows because he's convinced we'll get his whole company canceled and he'll go out of business. We aren't allowed to say anything on our Facebook pages except maybe what we ate for lunch. We can't say who we're going to vote for. We aren't supposed to praise or denigrate any TV programs or almost anything at all. So, although I'm sending you this story anonymously, I want you to know that we are huge Dogman fans and we all wanted to see one for a long time. We have vacationed in Wisconsin and we saw a bear, but no Dogman. We vacationed on the Chestnut Ridge in Pennsylvania and my one friend said he saw weird lights in the woods when he relieved himself late at night. No Dogman though. Then one day, I was driving just at the crack of dawn when it was still 85% nighttime, doing the same drive I always do at that time of the morning for reasons I can't get into here. And there he was, the Dogman. I mean, my buddies and I knew that there have always been stories of Dogman in West Virginia, but for whatever reason, we really didn't expect to see one here. Well, they still haven't. I was the only one in the car that late night or early morning. Obviously, our state is better known for the Mothman, but Point Pleasant, West Virginia, is around 4 hours of driving to the west of where this story took place. They're way over by Ohio, while we're on the side closest to Virginia. The entire area is surrounded by hills and mountains, with Durbin and Frank located in this east-to-west valley. They've got a little railroad that leads to nowhere that people like to come from miles around to ride and pretend they're in a time machine, seeing what life was like in the past. Well, that's the direction I saw this prehistoric-looking dog-headed ape-man come from. There's a camping area past that, and plenty of wilderness, so I don't know if he lived over there and was walking over here to get something, or if he had just gotten something at that campsite, and now he was going home again. In either case, he walked like a dogman that had a place to go. His eyes, which glowed bright in my headlights, never strayed from their goal and remained fixed ahead of himself. He didn't care about me and my car heading toward him. He just walked out onto the road and proceeded to get into my way. Now, on my left, the way I was heading, there was some kind of a home or building coming up where the dogman could have walked right out onto the road. Instead, he came up from about 20 feet closer to me, which would have been a much harder route when I looked at the map. He had to come up from down at the level the water streams down there up that fairly steep hill, then step over the little fence at the side of the road. Not that this thing minded small obstacles. It was a tall creature, at least 6 feet tall, but my gut tells me it might have been much taller. I don't have a clear enough memory of where its head was when it passed anything that I could go back and measure, so I really don't know how to tell how tall it was. What I saw was something that looked like a really angry dude. It was sort of bent over a bit and walking like it knew where the guy who his wife cheated on him with lived. Do you know that kind of walk? Like, you don't want to get in this guy's way. His head was like a feral dog of some sort. His legs were like the hind legs of a dog, but it was walking upright like a man, bent over at the waist but not slouched the way an ape would be. I don't really remember the paws or claws or arms very well, but I think they swung like a man's or an ape's. It was sort of grayish brown color, and I remember the breeze blowing its fur as it passed by. It wasn't very long fur, just long enough for the wind to ruffle it. The color was not like the color of a brown bear, and it was not solid and uniform all over. I don't remember much about it other than it seemed to incorporate shades of brown to tan to gray, kind of like some dogs or wolves. The mouth looked oversized for its head, giving the impression that it was some kind of a shark mammal, that it was designed to eat quickly and keep moving. The mouth looked like it always had to stay open because the teeth were so large, but I only saw it briefly. The tongue was not hanging out as in most dogs. The huge teeth were gritted in a grimace. I remember that the teeth were like taller versions of alligator teeth, in that some of them on the bottom overlapped the top lip, and some on the top overlapped the bottom lip. Snaggle-toothed is what I think they call it. I felt like that thing could bite a man's leg off in one chomp, but that was just my impression. I didn't see it bite anything, and I'm still a bit mystified about how large it might have actually been. The entire incident may have lasted 3 or 4 seconds. He came from nowhere, walking over the road fence to the left, crossing right in front of me in maybe 2 steps, then scrambling up the very steep little hill like he was hopping onto a pony or something. And then he was off into the trees up there and out of my view. To emphasize how fast this was over, I had only begun to react and hit the brake when the creature had already begun its little hop up that side hill to my right. I could never have stopped in time, but he was gone before I even needed to. I had slowed down, he was already gone, and I accelerated again as though there were traffic behind me, which there was not. I waited years for this opportunity, and yet I was so unprepared for the moment when it came that I just resumed driving to where I go every morning at that time. I didn't stop the car. I didn't get out to look for footprints or other evidence. I didn't try to climb that steep hill to the right and follow it. I didn't do anything at all. I didn't even really think these thoughts that I'm expressing now until I had already driven past that tourist railroad station already. That's how fast it happened and was already in my past. I remember pulling off the road and sitting there thinking about going back, wondering if it was already too late to do that. I got up enough courage that I opened the car door and I stepped outside, looking back in the direction I had come from. A cold breeze blew by, whistling at me, and I felt like I had stepped out of my safe, comfortable car into the opening scene in a horror movie. No sooner had I gotten out of that car than I shivered all over and got right back inside, feeling ashamed of myself for being such a coward. I told myself that I was throwing away the only chance I would ever get to find evidence of a dogman, but it was just too creepy out in that early morning, too eerily quiet, and I couldn't stop shivering. I slammed and locked my door. Then I sped off. Over the course of the morning, I told my story to my two buddies at work, and during lunch, we drove back and walked around the area I had seen the creature and where I thought it had been coming from. When it walked up from the creek and over the little fence on the side of the road, I felt certain that the ground it was climbing and walking on had to have been at least a little bit muddy. I thought that would be the best place to look for prints of one kind or another. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was all dry and rocky on that afternoon, and I saw no evidence of anything having ever passed that way. As for the railroad area, whatever isn't paved is well traveled. I literally couldn't pick out the exact spot that the dogman leaped and scrambled up into the forest. There wasn't anything landmarky enough to imprint it in my brain or for us to measure to get an accurate guess as to the creature's height. I guess as a dogman witness, I'm something of a failure. At least my two friends seem to think so. There is a campsite, as I told you, directly in line with where I saw the dogman coming from. My buddies both say that we need to go camping there later this summer, so I guess we do. Spending the entire night in the area of my sighting is not an idea that brings me joy. In fact, I've already begun having a recurring nightmare about being alone on the highway in my pajamas in the dark, with neither of my buddies anywhere to be seen. There's someone in the woods, up above me to my right. I can hear them moving around, but I can't see them. I don't know if it's my buddies or if it's the dogman, but I'm afraid to call out to them. I keep feeling that someone is standing right behind me, breathing on me with warm breath, but I turn around and nobody is there. I don't know if I really want to be camping out all night in that spot. I have a genuine fear of the place now every time I have to drive past it, at that same time each morning. Maybe camping out there with my buds will help me get over my nightmares. After all, the chances I'll ever see the dogman again are between 0 and 0, really. And once I survive the night there, then maybe I'll feel a whole lot better about things. That is, unless I get a return appearance from the Durbin Dogman. Today, we've got an encounter that the submitter thought was going to be about one thing, but it ended up being about him encountering a North American upright canid, or dogman. If you like what we do here, you can help us keep going by becoming a channel member. It's simple. You just click that join link below this video, and once you join as our thank you, we'll send you a link to an all-new secret uncensored story each Sunday night. Stories far too R-rated or something to air on this channel. One of our favorite supporters, who we are most grateful to, is today's executive producer, and her name is Mary Gillies. Mary Gillies, remember the lilies. She is hotter than the reddest hot chilies. I tend to have a bad case of sillies because I'm so grateful to sweet Mary Gillies. Thank you, Ms. G. We are eternally grateful, and believe me, your contributions are valued and appreciated. And now, let's jump into what Ms. Gillies donated for today's all-new Dogman story. And we call this one The Dog-Headed Man. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I grew up in a tiny town on the edge of Ohio, near West Virginia and Pennsylvania. Our house was on the corner, across the street from a trailer park in one direction, and a cemetery in the other. My father still lives in that little house, so for his sake, I'm not going to say exactly where the place is. The town is so small that our street literally ran 2 blocks before our part of it ended. We had mountains behind us, the cemetery in front of us, and more of the same mountains past that cemetery. Ever since I was young, I heard stories that there was a dog-headed man living in those trees on the other side of the cemetery. This is the story of when I decided to find out for myself. There was a kid who was 2 years older than me who used to hang out by the cemetery fence most of the day when there wasn't school. He was the only kid even somewhat close to my age, so I used to sometimes go and hang out with him. He was a real jerk, and I did not like him, but what could I do? We had a small black and white TV that I was allowed to watch 1 program per day on, and that was about it for entertainment. So no matter how big a jerk he was the last time I saw him, I would still go back and talk to the kid by the cemetery again and again. One day, Cemetery Boy and I got to talking about the dog-headed man. I asked him if he had ever heard about it, and he was like, "Heard about it? Why, I know the dog-headed man." I laughed, but he said he was being serious. I didn't believe a word he was saying, and I found him annoying. I went home to be alone. It would be less annoying than staying around him any longer. Still, the next time I saw him, he continued insisting that he knew the dog-headed man in the woods. We walked around to that side of the cemetery, and he showed me a path in the trees that he said was the way to go if you wanted to find the dog-headed man. I still didn't believe him, and I started to wonder why he was going through so much effort since I still wasn't believing anything he said. Over the weeks, Cemetery Boy dropped various anecdotes about the dog-headed man. He said he came from the Middle East, somewhere around Greece, yet he spoke with an American accent. He spoke? The dog-headed man spoke? And with an American accent? This story was ridiculous, yet Cemetery Boy would look really hurt when I would mock him, and would only make him try that much harder to convince me that he was being honest. One night, around 8 or 9, our doorbell rang and my father called me to the door. It was Cemetery Boy. He apologized to me for all the times he had played pranks on me or tricked me in the past. He said that now he was the boy who cried wolf, and when he really knew about something cool, I didn't even believe him anymore. I watched him cry, and it sure looked sincere. I had only seen girls cry on command at that age, so I concluded that Cemetery Boy must be on the level. After that, he started telling me things about the dog-headed man that made me more and more interested in him. I no longer thought that the kid was lying. I just wondered if he were insane. According to Cemetery Boy, the dog-headed man came to America hoping that he would be accepted here, when he had not been in his native land. Upon discovering that the people of the United States were just as horrified to look upon a man with the head of a dog as the Greeks had been, he fled to the woods to live the life of a hermit. I remember stopping Cemetery Boy to ask if the dog-headed man had once lived in our town. The kid seemed surprised by the question. I said, "Well, you told me he's living in the woods outside of our town because he got rejected by humanity. Does that mean he got rejected by someone here in our town?" Cemetery Boy looked flummoxed and shrugged his shoulders. He admitted he didn't know where in the USA the dog-headed man had lived. He just knew it wasn't long before he went to live in those woods up on the tall hills behind the cemetery. According to what I was told, the man loved human culture in spite of how we had mistreated him. He had an old wind-up record player and an entire wall of vinyl records, but nothing after the 1950s when he went to live back there. He had a library featuring most of the world classics of literature, as well as some of the most obscure books ever. He had ancient books from South America that were supposed to have been burned by the conquistadors, but were actually secreted away and sold on the black market. In order to survive, the dog-headed man was close friends with some of the world's most infamous super spies. There are some people who have figured out how to be both entirely unknown and supremely influential, both at the same time, and the dog-headed man was one of them. He subscribed to science journals as well as occult fanzines. His tastes were wide and varied and eclectic. I asked Cemetery Boy how he could know so much about the dog-headed man. He told me that once a month, he would get the man's mail from his P.O. box and deliver it to him in the woods. That's how he could see what magazines he was subscribed to and so forth. Even as a kid, I didn't think the story really held water. Still, if I were a dog-headed man, I would probably hire a kid to go get my mail for me too. I mean, to my kid's mind, the story sort of made sense. Kind of, anyhow. According to Cemetery Boy, the man had a collection of obscure old comic books, and he owned videotapes of some lost television programs from forgotten TV networks of the late 1940s. This was particularly interesting to me because I was actually a bit of a weirdo about old television. It was hard for me to find much to satisfy my curiosity about the early days of TV back then. There were a couple of shows on PBS I'd seen, and I found books about old comedians at the library that answered some of my questions. If that guy actually had programs from that era, wow. I started to wish I could meet this dog-headed man. I wouldn't mistreat him just because he had a dog's head. I would treat him just the same as I treated anyone else. Better if he let me watch his old TV shows and read his old comic books. By then, Cemetery Boy and I were meeting at the back of the graveyard by the forest every day. He'd tell me stories, and I would try not to believe him, but I really wanted what he said to be true. One late afternoon, as the sun had started to go down and we were both about to go home for dinner, I asked him if he could take me with him the next time he delivered the mail. He acted offended that I would even ask. That would be betraying a sacred confidence, he said, acting all huffy. I begged him, but he wouldn't relent. Finally, he told me I should just go knock on the door and introduce myself if I wanted to meet him. That surprised me, as I had not known that it was an option. How do you think I met him? Cemetery Boy asked, looking at me like I was an idiot. I told him I'd go knock on his door in the morning if he showed me the way. Cemetery Boy said the morning was no good. The dog man sleeps during the day and gets up at... Well, he was getting up right then, at dusk, and that was also his favorite time to receive visitors. I looked at the forest. It looked dark in there already. I asked Cemetery Boy if I couldn't just do it in the morning since it was dinner time now. He told me it would only take a minute and asked me if I was a chicken. Actually, he used a different word beside chicken, but you get the idea. So he pointed at where I should walk in, and he said I should count trees as I walked. At every fifth tree, I should stop and shout at the top of my lungs, "Hey, Mr. Dogman, watch out, 'cause I'm coming." Cemetery Boy said that if I didn't do that, I might startle the gentleman. Then I would be making a bad first impression. So, shout at every fifth tree. Then, on the 35th tree, I should look all around very carefully because the dog-headed man's house was there, but it was hidden and camouflaged and very hard to see. I had that bad feeling in my stomach that I was gonna get in trouble. I told him it was just too late, but I'd be up for doing it the following evening. He told me that was just as well because it's always better when visiting the dog-headed man to bring a present. I asked him what kind of a gift a dog-headed man would want, and he told me a big piece of meat. So the next morning, when I met Cemetery Boy, I had a frozen steak I had taken from the freezer wrapped in aluminum foil. We spent the day discussing the dog-headed man and the proper way to act when first meeting him. Don't stare. Don't ask to see his TV shows too soon. He might think you're pushy. As the sun started to set, my heart was beating like Ricky Ricardo playing Babalu. The steak was melting and bleeding all over the place, and I accidentally got some of it on my jeans and sneakers. Before heading off into the darkness, I asked one more time if Cemetery Boy couldn't come with me and introduce me. He told me to stop being a whiner, and then he turned and went home for his dinner. I faced the woods, and whether it was foolish or brave, I set off into the trees, counting them as I went. At the fifth one, I called out, "Hey, Mr. Dogman, watch out 'cause I'm coming." And I listened as some birds flew away, scared at my shouting. I felt kinda stupid by the time I'd reached the 15th tree, and I realized I was standing in the woods, holding my father's steak that he was gonna kill me for ruining, and that I was shouting to an imaginary man. I had been tricked. It was a very long-term prank, but it was a prank. It had to be. This entire thing was absurd, and I couldn't believe how long it had taken me to realize it. That is when I heard a very deep growling, and my knees turned to wobbly jelly underneath me. I pictured a leopard. I don't know why. I heard a big cat there in the darkness in front of me. Couldn't see it, but I could hear it. I had to hold onto a tree just to stand, and I started to feel nauseous. Then, a silhouetted figure began to differentiate itself from the rest of the darkness in front of me, and I was stunned to see that it was not a big cat at all. It wasn't even a four-legged creature. It was like a kind of a werewolf or wolfman, but the head was entirely like that of a wolf. I don't mean like some makeup effects sort of thing. I mean, it was a hairy monster man with the head of a dog. Head of a dog? I stared, actually wondering if I should introduce myself and try to talk to this dog-headed man, as the cemetery kid had told me he had. But something was wrong. This did not appear to be an erudite aficionado of the early days of television. This seemed to be some kind of a savage animal that walked like a man. Even the outline of it told me that, especially when coupled with that tiger-like growling. I watched as this animal walked bipedally close enough that I could get a good sense of what I was seeing. The first feature that became visible were the eyes glowing in the darkness. They also, like the growl, reminded me of a cat, but the snout was canine, and the look on its face was one I had seen before on angry guard dogs. It was not an expression that was easy to forget. I want to say that the dogman had arms like a man, but they were also kind of still very canine as well. He held them out in front as he walked. It half reminded me of a dog putting its paws together as though praying, and also half reminded me of the way monsters in the old movies would hold their hands or claws out in front of them, I guess to menace us or something. His shoulders were kind of a little hunched over as he walked, but it still stood more upright than a gorilla or a chimp. The legs were like kangaroo legs, kind of, but it walked, not hopped. I say kangaroo legs because they were super muscular. I mean, maybe if you make a dog's legs extra muscular, then you get kangaroo legs, I don't know. But it had much more massive legs than any human I've ever been aware of. This was like a character drawn by Jack Kirby from the old comic books. Speaking of which, I wasn't going to be reading any old comic books that night, I suddenly understood. In fact, I would be lucky if I got home alive. I threw the wilted steak at the creature, then I turned and I ran. I know all the stuff they say about don't run from a predator, but this was back when I was 17 or 18, and I didn't know about any fancy advice like that yet. We didn't have the internet in those days, and we basically only learned things by doing them. So I remember running through the tombstones in the cemetery. It's actually 2 cemeteries, and it was a lot of running. You know how in the movies, people who are scared can run and run endlessly for miles? Well, that's called editing. I was on the school track team for a while until I got kicked off, but I still ran daily. When you're going all out, it gets exhausting pretty quickly, and at least for me, knowing that a predator was chasing me did not add any speed to my run. In fact, it kind of paralyzed me with fear. I had been in some altercations in my day, but I had not before ever actually been at risk of losing everything. I didn't know if I would make it home. I didn't know if I would see my parents again. It caused me to breathe badly and nervously and to lose a step or two in the process. When I would look behind, I would see the Dogman. Once it was out in the cemetery, you could really see how big it was. In the forest, I had thought it was maybe 5.5 or 6 feet tall, but next to the tombstones, I could see that even bent over like that, he was over 6 feet. He also seemed to be only trotting along after me. His light trot was keeping pace with my all-out run, though, so obviously he could have overtaken me at any time. I figured he was trying to tire me out, and I honestly thought he was going to succeed. The way I came out of the cemetery was right across the street from Cemetery Boy's house. I was stunned to see him in the front window, looking out at me and smiling a weird smile. The Dogman didn't look like he was going to stop at the cemetery limits. He seemed to be following wherever I led. Panicked, I ran up to Cemetery Boy's door and began banging on it frantically. He just pointed at me and laughed. He had done all this on purpose. I ran down his driveway and jumped his back fence into the next backyard over. There was a middle-aged man in a chaise lounge reading a magazine in that yard. I recognized him as a friend of my father, and I called out to him. He looked confused and annoyed at me as I ran past him and up the side of his house toward the street. Behind me, I heard my father's friends shouting, and I knew who and what he was shouting at. I was never made privy to what happened back there, but I know the Dogman didn't follow me any longer, and I know that guy always gave me weird looks after that. So, even though he was the only kid around my age, I never hung out with Cemetery Boy ever again. I never had to confess to stealing my father's steak, because he assumed my mother was secretly cooking and eating his prime cuts when he was at work. I felt guilty about starting a fight between the two of them, but not guilty enough to tell my parents that I stole the steak to give it to an imaginary man in the woods with a kick-ass video collection of tapes of shows that never existed. Somehow, I don't think my parents would have understood if I had told them about the dog-headed man. Today we've got 3 of the strangest Dogman stories ever, and one of the nicest executive producers ever, Hagridella. Hagridella, psychedella. Hagridella, what's a fella to do? Thank you, Ms. Smirnoff, for your kindness and support as we go through difficult times as usual. We quite literally couldn't do it without nice folks like you. Please consider becoming a Scary Stories executive producer like Hagridella, and you'll get access to our new secret uncensored stories each Sunday, plus the entire archive of over 10 hours of uncensored scary stories. Just click the join button underneath the video and the rest should explain itself. We'll be happy to welcome you aboard. Today's stories are strange ones. Those are our favorite kinds of stories around here. I don't know about you, but I like stuff that's different. I don't just like the same thing over and over. And that's why I particularly like this next story. I saw Dogman walk out of reality. Dear Scary Stories NYC, sometimes I think life is unfair. It seems like the bullies and the liars always win. But every once in a while, the universe hits the reset button and the world becomes a little more fair for a little while. For example, in this story I'm about to tell you, someone was a jerk to me. I was upset about it at first, but now I realize that if they hadn't been such a complete creep, I would never have gotten to witness an actual dogman walk right out of our reality. This happened years ago when I lived with a narcissist and a psychopath who had no problem making up complete fantasies they would then angrily claim were real so that they could get those sweet, sweet internet victimhood points. We had 2 cats, and at the time, we allowed them to go in and out of the house as they pleased. I wouldn't do that with cats any longer, but back then I was under the impression that it was good for them, so we would keep at least one of the windows open wide enough for them to get in and out. On a very hot day, I once went on Facebook and saw that he had written that he was hot and his life was miserable because I kept opening the windows up. In fact, on that date in history, the only time all the windows were even shut was when I saw that both the cats were inside and I took my chance to close it all down. Why did I do that? Because my roommate was being dramatic and making a big deal about how he was hot. Remember, it wasn't hot for anyone else, just this guy. And because he was hot, that meant he was the world's greatest victim, and I was the one ruining his life, basically. Can you imagine the sorrow? So, one time near the end of that period, when I had already started making plans to move out, he threw a particularly psychotic narcissist rant, including various bizarre fantasy concepts at the base of even more bizarre arguments. It was something about the air conditioning again, I don't remember. So I went outside with the cats, and we sat on the back porch, and it was 77 degrees out with a nice breeze. He was inside complaining about the air conditioning and pitying himself, while we were enjoying a cool evening. I guess that in itself was sort of a good lesson to learn. He was so concerned with informing us of his importance, insisting on it, no matter how many fabrications he had to throw in to try to glue his various straw men together. I, on the other hand, had and have no illusions or delusions about my importance. Neither did those cats. We just hung out, grateful for the friendly company and the fact that another heat wave had come to an end. Can you imagine childishly and petulantly demanding pity about something that everyone is experiencing equally? That takes a special kind of ego, don't you think? This is not a person to be angry at. This is a person to feel badly for. Think how much pain they put themselves through, striving for weird, unattainable goals, willing to say or do anything in order to gain status that is never even real and does them no good in any sense of the word, lying about the people who care about them the most. These kinds of people deserve our prayers, not our condemnation. These kinds of people can never know the simple happiness that we all get to feel deeply inside ourselves every time we feel grateful and content with the present moment. We can keep working on self-improvement while simultaneously accepting ourselves as completed already in that moment of self-improvement. Even if the words I'm saying don't make sense to you, if you're able to appreciate a sunrise or a sunset or a beautiful work of art or music and be completely moved to tears by the exquisite sanctity of that, and by extension, every moment, then you know exactly what I mean. If you can be happy in the rain at least sometimes, then you're already there. Well, like I said, at least sometimes. And if we're able to be happy in the moment, then we owe it to others not to be angry at them if their happiness muscles are atrophied. I was so happy just to be outside of the negative energy field for the first time that day. It was sheer ecstasy, and all I was doing was sitting there with 2 sleeping cats. And then, the moment you've all been waiting for happened. It was the moment I had been waiting for too, but I didn't know it at the time. From around the right side of the house, walking toward my left, about 30 or 35 feet away from us, This bipedal, upright, walking, dog-like creature just strolled on up. I internalized it as a werewolf. That was what it looked like. One from the movies. It had a wolf-like head, a very long neck, and a relatively thin-armed and thin-legged body. But dogs have relatively thin arms and legs when they're down on all fours, too. It still looked dangerous and, well, it looked like a monster. It was covered in fur of a very dark color, and I could see that the skin was pale and grayish. The fur was pretty thin, but it was equally thin all over, not in patches as though it had mange. It's possible I was viewing a werewolf after all. Maybe that was not fur, but human hair. Or werewolf hair, I suppose would be the better way to put it. Maybe that's why the hair seemed thin compared to that of a normal dog or wolf. Maybe it wasn't a dogman. It's possible that my first guess was correct. Possibly it really was an actual werewolf. I remember studying it all over quickly, hoping I could see a zipper or some sign that this was a guy in a costume. I think I said something out loud along the lines of, "If this is a joke, somebody needs to explain the punchline to me." It saw me, seeing it, and huffed, a grunting sort of noise, sounding more like a gorilla than a canine. One of the cats ran around the side of the house to get away from there, and the other one arched its back and hissed. I never saw its tail fuzz out like that before. That cat looked more like a raccoon, and its hair stood all on end like it was a porcupine. I wouldn't be surprised if my hair was doing the same thing. The dogman looked at us, then turned back to looking in front of it. Then it took another step and a half and disappeared as though it had walked behind a green screen. Do you know what I mean? It looked as though it had walked through a door, but there was no visible door there in our backyard. There was a straight line perpendicular to the ground beyond which that dogman no longer was visible. And I don't think it was becoming invisible. I think it was leaving our reality. I mainly think this because the cat started calming down as soon as the dogman left. I think if it were still there but visually cloaked, the cat would still be stressing out. Unless it could also cloak its smell and bioelectric field, I doubt that it would be hidden from the cat at all. Because of these reasons, I am left with the inescapable conclusion that I saw Dogman walk out of reality. The floating Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I want to tell you about my cousin Benny and me seeing a dogman in our uncle's backyard in Teaneck, New Jersey, back in 1968. We were camping out in his backyard all the way in the back by the tree line. We were pretending we were out in the wilderness, but actually, those trees were only about 30 deep and 15 or 20 wide, if I'm remembering correctly. It was just enough trees that you couldn't see into the next property over, and it blocked sound from passing in both directions for the most part. Just a thick, deep, natural fence or property demarcation. We didn't care. In our tents, in front of those trees, we might as well have been in the most remote woodlands in the United States of America. We each brought our collection of old Marvel Comics horror and sci-fi reprints. They were written by Stan Lee and drawn by guys like Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko. Some of them had twist endings, like The Twilight Zone. Some of them were about giant monsters from outer space wearing underpants and terrorizing humanity. Sometimes they even had stories about monsters in the woods. We took turns reading them aloud. I would read one of my favorite stories from one of my comic books. Then Benny would read one of his favorites, showing me the pictures at appropriate moments. This was sort of our way to tell scary ghost stories while camping out. We weren't allowed a campfire, so we told the stories using a flashlight while laying on the lawn outside our tent. Whoever had the flashlight had the floor. Those are fun memories. The next thing that happened, however, I would classify under a horrific memory. Here goes. Neither of us saw where it had come from, but we both thought it must have come from inside the trees. I remember first seeing a dog's head up about 7 or 8 feet off the ground. I was young though, so maybe it was only 6 feet up. Who knows? My point is that there was a dog head up there, and it was on top of this weird kind of dog body that was in some ways kind of like an ape's body. Well, not entirely. I mean, the back legs looked like dog legs as they stretched out behind it and dragged along the ground. It seemed to be floating forward, not walking, not jumping, but floating. It wasn't quite off the ground, though, as I had indicated. Imagine some kind of werewolf creature straight out of the comic books. Then imagine that it's being held up somehow by its shoulders, and it's moving forward via floating. But it's not completely off the ground, so the feet are dragging behind it. The creature was dark, but an unnatural kind of dark. I don't mean it was a shadow being. I mean the fur was dark in a different way than I'd seen animal fur look before. It didn't look at us. It floated along in front of the trees. The eyes and the entire creature had an odd and very slight electrical glow to it. I would compare the glow to that of an old black and white television set. I mean the really old ones that would emit a bluish glow. You used to be able to look at a house or apartment building at night and tell who was watching TV inside by which windows had that bluish glow in them. That was the kind of glow this thing seemed to emit, although it was very faint when we were close. Running at our top speed back to our uncle's house, I remember looking back at the creature, and from that distance, its glowing actually seemed more intense than it had up close. We both noticed a kind of faint glow around the very edges of the creatures as it moved forward. Benny thought it was some kind of a force field around the entity, which is probably what was allowing it to float along like that. I guess that might have been what it was, but I didn't feel that way in the moment, so it doesn't seem like the correct explanation to me. I thought that we were witnessing artifacts or noise. Like if you take a small JPEG and enlarge it, you're going to see a light-colored blurry line around the outside edges of the figures in the image. This seemed like that to me, an image being projected, at least in that one sense. I think it was holographic or something like that, because when I ran toward the house and moved my point of view, I was able to see it from different angles. That proved that the image was in 3 dimensions and not flat. So who would have been projecting a moving hologram of a dogman into a backyard in Teaneck, New Jersey in the hot summer of 1968? And why would anyone have done that? On the other hand, what if that thing just was what it was? What if it was a real thing that somehow just existed in that way? I admit that makes no sense to me, so I still think it was some form of early 3-dimensional holographic projection. I'm willing to have my mind changed, though. So what do you all think? Dogman versus Big Mouth. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My buddy Ken and I saw David Polites on YouTube talking about the Montana Vortex house, and we only live about a 3-hour drive from there, so we wanted to go. We decided to bring camping gear with us and make a night of it, then travel home the next day. I have to say that although nothing very specific happened inside the Vortex house to us, it felt like something was about to happen the entire time we were there. We both felt a weird sort of energy that neither of us were able to describe or compare to anything we'd felt before. It was kind of as though excitement itself were swirling through the air around us. I know that doesn't make much sense, but the feelings we had were somewhat paradoxical and nonsensical. We decided to find a spot in the woods between the Vortex House and the Snakehead River and camp there. I don't know if that's public or private land, and we were both ready to throw the tent in our truck and get gone if need be. But that didn't happen. It was a beautiful night, with billions of stars shining more brightly than I'd ever seen them shine before. We both decided we wanted to wait till the museum opened the next day and give it one more visit before we left. And then we got in our sleeping bags and we called it a day. In the middle of the night, I had to get up to relieve myself, and I wandered half awake away from the tent so I wouldn't have to smell it. I was standing behind some tall bushes doing my business when I saw a light flash on the other side of the bush I was standing behind. It looked just like a camera flash. I was afraid someone had just taken a photo of me, so I peeked through the bush to see who that was on the other side. But I didn't see a human being, either holding a camera or not. It was some kind of a Bigfoot. I saw what I can only describe as a hairy, man-like thing with no visible head and a wide mouth across its belly. It could clearly see by the way it was behaving, yet I don't know where its eyes were. Imagine a man with no head, because his torso itself is his head. This was the strangest Bigfoot possible, if it was a Bigfoot. I think there was a monster like this in the Beatles cartoon movie, but I don't think I've ever heard about such a thing existing even in mythology. Is there a name for this kind of monster? Have you ever heard of such a thing? I stood frozen behind the tall bushes and watched as a blinding light appeared out of nowhere in the field behind the strange 7 or 8 foot tall creature. From that blinding light emerged what looked like a werewolf, I suppose, or a were-dog maybe, since its features more closely resembled a dog than a wolf. It was kind of a German shepherd man. The paws were like hands, or partially. It walked on its hind legs out of the light, which disappeared behind it. The two creatures turned to each other, and I half expected them to start chatting like fellow ensigns on the USS Enterprise. But that's not what happened. The dog-headed Bigfoot adopted a hostile pose and began whining and growling at the big-mouth Bigfoot. The dog leaned in to snap at the larger creature, and when the big-mouth monster snapped back, he nearly took the dogman's entire head with him. This was going to be a horrible scene, and I didn't want to play the winner, so I booked it out of there, basically. I heard them fighting behind me. It sounded almost like 2 elephants going at it. Now, I know what those people in the movies running away from Godzilla feel like. If I didn't get out of there, those creatures were going to fall over on top of me, and then I'd be a goner. So I kind of tiptoed and skedaddled in a guilty way back to the tent, as though I had done something wrong. Maybe I was just really not awake enough to think clearly, but instead of waking my buddy up and getting out of there, I just climbed back in my sleeping bag, and I went back to sleep. The next day, I kind of forgot about the whole thing, but then when we were at the Vortex house, the guy was talking about Bigfoot coming through the vortex. He had given us the same spiel the day before, but this time, it really meant something personal to me. That's when I remembered what happened in the middle of the night, and I told Ken about it. He got angry and asked me why I hadn't awakened him when the monsters were there. I told him it was because I needed him to get his beauty rest, and we both laughed, but the truth is, I don't know why I didn't wake him up. Maybe something about the incident itself told me to forget I saw it. Like how some people see UFOs, and then go back to bed, and can't explain why later on. Have you ever listened to Paul and Ben Eno? E-N-O? They do a show called Behind the Paranormal and they have an odd theory based on their personal experiences that says that all aspects of the paranormal, Bigfoot, Dogman, flying saucers, demons, ghosts, all of it, is all part of the same exact thing, and it all has something to do with vortexes being used as a means of transportation between realities and dimensions. Maybe that's what I saw. Maybe that's what that entire area around the Montana vortex is. Otherwise, I have no explanation at all as to how or why I saw Dogman versus Big Mouth. We've got some cool new channel members who will be making executive producers of the day too. In fact, let's announce today's executive producer, who is Daniel D'Amico. Our EP by the name of Daniel makes the others look like they're Cocker Spaniels. He once played chess with Andre Gromyko. Lol, no he didn't. He's Daniel D'Amico. Thanks, Daniel D'Amico. We couldn't stay online without the kind support of badass individuals like yourself. If any of you guys out there would like to be regarded with the respect and awe with which we hold Daniel D'Amico, who never met Andre Gromyko, all you have to do is become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then, you'll get an extra secret, uncensored scary story each Sunday, something that would be far too wild for us to run on this channel. Plus, you can check out our archives of secret stories, which are now over 10 hours long. You know, there's been a lot of speculation as to the nature of the Dogman. Are they real and normal animals like bears or mountain lions? Are they extra-dimensional or even illusions? Do they reproduce like other land mammals? The fellow who submitted the basis of this next story to us claims he can answer at least some of these questions. His story has a title that might sound a little racy, but don't worry, it's not what you think. And that racy title is I Saw a Dogman Reproduce. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have not been well for the last 5 weeks. I experienced a traumatic episode with something which I think was a dogman, and it left me unable to speak at all for days after it happened. When I could talk again, I found that discussing the incident brought the terror of those moments back, and I would become incoherent, screaming in fear. I've been advised not to think about it until I've healed more, but I know personally that it is now time for me to stand up to this fear. I need to tell you what happened. I need to write down what happened while I can still remember every moment of it. I need to do it for myself. I need to read it back and accept that this is what really happened. This will be another step closer to healing for me, so thank you for this forum. I won't tell you my name because I can't afford to be branded crazy and cancelled from my job. I have a wife and 2 daughters, and my wife is currently expecting our first son. I lost almost an entire month of work already due to what happened, and it's imperative that I restore my old reputation of being the reliable one, or my family might lose everything. I need to show up to work with a smile on my face, and I need to laugh at my boss's jokes, and I need to get more work done than humanly possible. I don't need to go around talking about how I saw a monster have a baby of itself. Wow, that sounded crazy. I gave myself a chill just by saying that. They really would lock me away if I went public with what happened, wouldn't they? I live and work in a Midwest state. That's as detailed as I'm gonna get with the location. We live in a prefab gated community styled to look like an area in the country, and my company has offices in a nearby city as well as their own corporate headquarters building in a suburb about a 45-minute drive from my home. During the health crisis, I'm needed to work from both locations at different times in order to supervise our labor force, who is mostly working from home at the moment. Sometimes, some of the employees request to come in and work from the office for a day or two, such as on extremely hot days. We allow them to do that within limits, and I have to physically be there at the site on those days. About a third of the time I'm home, and it seems that all I ever do these days is drive back and forth between the 3 locations. I'm not complaining about that part though. It's afforded me more alone time than I ever had before, since I've always worked in large offices around tons of other people. Now, for the first time in my life, I have a favorite podcast. I never had time to listen to podcasts before, but now I'm a fan of several of them, which I listen to in the car while driving back and forth. Sometimes I don't even need a podcast to be entertained, as I do live in a very beautiful state. Most of the driving I do is along country highways lined with trees, and it's just gorgeous. Even on rainy days, I usually love to drive any of those routes. There is such a wonderful aliveness of being in nature, even if you're speeding through it at 55 miles an hour. I like to roll the windows down and smell the forest around me. Fortunately, my traumatic incident has not taken the joy out of driving in the country. I do roll up my windows when I drive after dark now, though. I can't put it off any longer. I've given you more than enough background on myself. I need to tell you my story now. My mind still screams at me not to think about it. I'm feeling as though writing it down will be the same as living through it again, which I know is illogical. I'm told it's natural to feel that way, but it annoys me. I don't like being illogical. I'm the logical one. I'm the reliable one. I never see crazy things, and I never say crazy stuff. This could not have happened to me, and yet it did. Like I said, this was around 5 weeks ago. I had really had a busy day driving back and forth between offices, thwarting one disaster after another, and now I was finally able to call it a day and drive home. I think it was around 8 or 9 at night, and I was bushed. I had been playing a podcast in the car, but when I realized I hadn't been listening, I turned it off and just let my mind rest for a while. Keeping the car moving forward on the 2-lane country blacktop was the only job I wanted to have in that moment. I was already hoping my wife wouldn't mind me going straight to bed, and this was before anything strange had happened at all. I came around a turn in the road that veers left fairly severely and keeps doing it for a while. There is a higher elevation on your left there, so you can't really see what's around the bend until you're already making the turn. They've got warning signs up, and it's part of the drive where you'd better keep your eyes open. I had nearly been rammed head-on by a bad driver one night, and I've been on guard about that turn ever since. On this particular night, as I finished making the turn, my eyes caught some kind of light reflecting back at me from the distance. My foot instinctively lightened up on the gas, and I started pressing the brake instead. I wanted to slow down and figure out what kind of vehicle that was down there on the unlit road. For it to be shining that brightly, I had to either have been looking at some kind of reflective material catching my headlights, or else I was looking at some kind of electric lighting. That's what I thought. But what I just told you only made sense for a second, until I got the disorienting feeling that those lights were too far up off the ground to be on the fender of a car or the back seat of a bicycle. They also seemed to be off the highway to the right of the road, over by the forest, but moving erratically toward the highway. By the time my headlights illuminated the scene enough for me to comprehend what was going on, the light source had moved onto the road in front of me. Those lights were eyes in the head of an apparently mammalian, hairy monster thing, like something out of a nightmare. I screamed to try to wake up, and I stopped the car completely. I pinched myself painfully hard, but I still could not wake up. I needed to stop this reality from playing out I was not a person who saw monsters. I don't understand how something impossible could happen to me. I'm a practical individual. I don't have flights of imagination. I don't even have an imagination. My value to the world is my sanity and my boring nature. I can't have insane episodes. I can't suddenly have an interesting life. And yet, this is what happened. The form this particular walking nightmare took was similar to werewolves in some movies. It looked like a man in a costume, except the head was not something a human could fit his skull into. This was a genuine-looking wolf head, but with larger than normal teeth. It was hairy all over, unclothed, yet bipedal as though it were a man. The monster had a big belly, which caused me to wonder if it were pregnant. There were other physical characteristics, however, that made me certain I was witnessing a male creature, not a female. It was a tall, male, dog-headed, bipedal monster with a distended belly, and it was blocking my forward progress on the highway that dark night. I started screaming as the belly almost erupted into something that made no sense to me even as I witnessed it happening. While the dogman writhed in apparent extreme discomfort, his belly elongated and enlarged and shaped itself into another bipedal form. I felt like I was going to be ill as I saw another dogman begin to shape itself out of the disgusting biological jello emanating from the monster's midsection. Soon there were two dogmen, both collapsed on the highway, contorted in pain, covered in slime, the one on the left still growing his hair, which I could witness filling out in under a minute's time. I remember telling myself, I'm insane, over and over again. I'm still not sure that wasn't the real explanation right there. I could not progress forward with my car, and I hadn't regrouped enough yet inside my mind to think about making a U-turn and driving a different route home. I just sat there, stunned, my eyes opened as wide as my jaw. When the dogman recovered a bit from their split in two, one of them noticed the smell of the other. Rising quickly, it adopted a defensive pose. The new dogman, noticing this submissive behavior, took the offense and soon pounced on the first one, who darted away into the woods with such speed it was as though he had become a blur. Both dogmen were off into the forest again, chasing each other, and I could now return to driving. That's what I did. But when I was closer to home, a kindly police officer pulled me over. He asked me why I was driving 30 miles under the speed limit. I had no idea I was doing that, but when I tried to tell him so, no words came out of my mouth. The panic that ensued from realizing that I could no longer control my vocal cords led to me just sort of blanking out the rest of that week. Sometimes, when your mind knows you can't handle something, it'll put you into shock or even a coma just so that you can take a break before trying to deal with what happened. At least I think that's sort of how they explained it to me. I didn't believe in the dogman before this happened. I especially don't believe in the creature now. No mammal can reproduce like that. Amoebas do. They're single-cell organisms. A highly complex animal like a dogman would not be able to just clone itself that way. It isn't possible, and therefore, what I saw could not, and did not, and does not exist. It had to be a product of overwork, a hallucination I had due to stress. So, the lesson of the story is to make sure to get enough rest if you're working double and triple shifts like me. Make sure you take a day off now and then. If you don't, your mind may begin to fill in the relaxation and leisure time gaps with insane projections of impossible monsters doing incredible things. Unless the lesson of the story is that we really know very little about our world. There may be creatures and events happening around us at every single moment that would seem impossible to us because of the severe limitations of our knowledge and our wisdom. Maybe the real lesson is that we should stop thinking we understand what the world is or what life is or what we're supposed to be doing here. Maybe that's the real lesson, but I don't care. I need to take care of my family, and that means the Dogman does not exist. That means I need at least 1 day off per week, and that means I need to take better care of myself. But it also means the Dogman cannot exist. Because if I said Dogman was real, then my kids would lose their home. So that, more than anything else in the world, proves to me that what I saw was nothing more than a stress-induced illusion. And to conclude this, I would like to issue a fervent request to that stress-induced illusion that I saw. Please, sir, don't appear to me again. My life has been falling apart since the day I shouted, "I saw a Dogman. Reproduce." I saw a vision of Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I sort of saw a Dogman once. At the time I thought it was a dream, but as I'll explain, it was far more than that. This was a long time ago in the year 2002. I had been dating a girl for a couple of months, and it felt to me like it was time to make it exclusive. I thought we should only date each other. I was thinking she might be a good woman to marry. It would have been a bad thing if we had, though, and I was blocked from that fate anyhow by the Dogman. So I had saved up for months to buy a ring for my girl, who we can call Allison. I wasn't sure if it was an engagement ring or a pre-engagement ring. I was 23 years old, but I was a young 23. I didn't know much about the ways of adults back then. I thought I'd give it to her and watch her reaction, and then decide what the ring meant. When I finally had it in my possession, it was a Saturday afternoon. We had a date that night, so I went home to take a disco nap. I wanted to have lots of stamina to go late into the night with her, in case things went well. I had a nightmare during my nap, and I remember this because I woke up in the middle of it, and I wrote it down in my dream journal that I used to keep next to my bed. I was watching a woman combing her hair in her bedroom, looking at herself in the mirror. It was night, and the glass door leading to her back garden was open. In walked something that was the exact archetype of the modern Dogman. It was a savage, frantic, twitchy, scary-looking dog-headed werewolf-type monster man, and it kept looking around really fast and smelling everything in her room for a second here and a second there. His eyes looked wild and crazy. They were open too wide. The woman turned, and I could see it was Allison. That was when I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart thumping like two drummers playing different beats at the same time. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my phone, intending on calling Allison to see if she was okay. But as I was about to put the call through, I realized I was being ridiculous. I had just had a dream. There are no such things as werewolves or dogmen. I must just have had nerves because I had invested so much money into that ring. I jumped in the shower to get ready for my big night. In the middle of my shower, my phone rang, and I knew it had to be Allison, so I jumped out to get the call. I was dripping wet and trying to dry myself off, making a puddle in my bedroom when I got her call. She was crying, and I couldn't understand anything she was saying at first. I got her to calm down, and then she told me that this big, hairy guy had broken into her family's house and gotten into her room. She thought he was going to end her life, but her father heard the commotion and came into the room. Then the big, hairy guy jumped out her window and ran away. She said the police were over, and that she had to cancel our date. I was like, what? I asked her if I should come over to help her through this tough night. She said no. She wanted to be with her family. I understood, but it felt cold to be reminded that I was not, in fact, considered by her to be a member of her family. That was when I realized I did consider her a member of my family. I could see then that I loved her more than she loved me. So I stayed home, and I watched TV, but I couldn't pay attention to it. I felt as though my bubble had been burst, but there was also so much else going on there. I had dreamed about a werewolf invading her home, and then she called crying, saying a big, hairy guy broke in. Could it have actually been a dogman? If the police were there, she wouldn't be likely to say werewolf or dogman, would she? No. She would probably call the intruder a big, hairy guy. Then again, maybe it really was a tall, hairy human being, and in my dream, warning me about the incident, maybe my subconscious mind transformed it into a werewolf as a sort of symbol for a big, hairy guy. I couldn't wait to talk to Allison about it and get more details. The thing is, her parents called me the next day to inform me that their daughter was going to be going away for an extended period. They were very kind about it, and they apologized profusely, but they were inflexible in informing me that I was not going to be able to talk to her for quite some time, at least 90 days. They never gave me any more details than that. I sold the ring back, and I moved on with my life. I didn't get serious again for over 5 years, but that woman is my wife right now. Hi, honey. I'm only saying nice things about you, so please don't emotionally torture me over this old story. I never got to talk to Allison ever again. I saw her in the park one day a few years ago. She's all bloated now from the medications they have her on. I've been told by several people that she's not really all there when they talk to her. I could have gone over and spoken to her that day. I could have tried to ask her what really happened on that night. The official story is that she was scared by a hairy man who her father chased off. That doesn't sound like a traumatic enough situation to lead to a lifetime of dangerous prescription meds and that faraway stare that I saw in her eyes in the park on that day. I still wonder if I already know what happened that night. I wonder how accurate my dream was when I saw a vision of Dogman. In our previous episode, we honored Shelia, who had upgraded her channel membership. Today, we honor a gentleman who has done the same thing, more than doubling his monthly contribution to our channel. Clearly, this is a man to be celebrated and thanked. Who is this mighty individual? None other than Godzilla Tim. Timothy Walker. He's no balker. People stare at him because they're all just gawkers. They all wish that they were him. That's because he's Godzilla Tim. Thank you, Godzilla Tim, for your help through this very crazy time. If any of you out there would like to be as cool as Mr. Walker, just join our channel by clicking the join link below this video or join our PayPal club at peterbernard.com. Either way, you gain access to our weekly uncensored secret scary stories and our archive of over 10 hours of uncensored stories far too wild to run on this channel. Say, do you know what Venetian blinds are? Have you ever seen old antique metal Venetian blinds from the 1960s? You know, before they got all fancy with the designs. Well, that's what this story is about. That and a dogman. So, we call this one The Dogman in the Venetian Blinds. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had a dogman experience when I was very young. In fact, I had nearly convinced myself it was something I dreamed or imagined before I discovered other people's sightings of similar creatures. Let me just tell you what happened to me. This was back in the late 60s or maybe 1970 at the latest. I was in my parents' first house, which we moved out of in late 1970. And that's how I know it couldn't have happened later than that unless it really was a dream. We had a home in upstate New York in an area known for Bigfoot sightings. It was suburban, but still surrounded by beautiful countryside. It's become more urban since then, but it's still a lovely area, and my mom still lives there, although not in the same house where this story took place. Our backyard was on the edge of a small woodland, and we would see animals sometimes that you aren't going to see in the cities. One day, I saw a bear cub, and my mother locked the house up, pointing out that where there is a cub, there must also be a mama bear. If she hadn't seen the bear cub when I did, and locked me inside, I probably would have run over to it hoping to play. I was not the smartest of kids. So, score 1 for Mom. If not for her, I never would have lived to tell you this story. That's probably the last good thing that I'll get to say about my poor old mom in this story, unfortunately. Here we go. I was in the living room watching TV. We had a black and white TV set, and I was looking at a Japanese cartoon, maybe Speed Racer or Gigantor, one of the early black and white anime shows from before I ever heard the word anime. At some point, there was a noise at the window, which was open, but covered with the old metallic Venetian blinds that they had in that house. I remember they were heavy and solidly constructed, and I wasn't allowed to touch them, but I did anyway. I heard the sound of them being moved, which was very distinctive and hard to compare to any sounds you'd be likely to hear nowadays. They had horizontal, slightly curved metallic slats painted a beige color to dull them so they wouldn't reflect light. They kind of clattered a little in an aluminum slats kind of a way, as the wind would push the blinds in and out. It got annoying after a while, so I went over to the window to try to figure out how to close it so that the wind would stop blowing the Venetian blinds. As I approached them, though, a surprising thing happened. A dog stuck his head through the slats, right in front of my face. I remember this made me laugh, and I giggled as he pulled his head back outside again. I wanted to help the dog stick his head in the window if he wanted to, since I had only met nice dogs up till then, and I loved canines of any sort. I lifted the Venetian blinds, still giggling, to allow him to poke his dog head into the room. However, when I lifted those blinds, what I saw on the other side wasn't a dog head at all, and that confused me. It was sort of a wall of fur looking back at me. I didn't understand what I was seeing, so I remember sticking my head out of the window to look more closely at that strange wall of fur. It smelled like backstage at the zoo, a smell I was familiar with from a very young age. I reached out to touch the strangely swaying wall of fur, and when I did, the wall jerked back quickly and I heard a growling from up over my head. Looking up, I saw an image that has never left me. I saw that same dog head as before, but not looking friendly any longer. It looked angry, and it pulled its lips back to show me how long and sharp his teeth were. The wall of fur was the belly of the beast. The dog wasn't a dog at all. It was a hairy, man-shaped, bear-type animal with a dog's head way up on top, and that formerly friendly-looking dog head snarled down directly toward my face. I pulled my head back into the house fast and banged the back of my head on the frame as I came back in. Having more than enough reasons for a kid to cry, I did just that, and probably very loudly. Running into the kitchen, I found my mother and her friend talking about boring adult stuff. I told her that a monster man hurt me, and she told me to shut up and stop being rude to our neighbor. This was 1970-ish. It wasn't like now where kids boss parents around. I just sat there with my head throbbing until I passed out on the floor and she could see I really had banged my head up. I remember waking up in the hospital and my mother yelling at me for a while about how I better not do that again to her. The doctor laughed as she shouted and made me cry, and then he proceeded to talk to her about me as though I weren't there in the room with them. The doctor demanded I explain how the injury happened, so I told him the entire story of the Venetian blinds, and Gigantor, and the dog head, and then how I found out that it was a dogman and not a regular dog. My mother told me I was a bad boy and a liar, and I remember crying because I had told her the truth. She told me she was so angry that she wasn't even going to punish me for lying. That made me cry even more because when she said she wasn't going to punish me, that meant she was going to make me tell my father what happened. He never wanted to hear it, and he was always in a bad mood about everything. He would usually use corporal punishment on me and then get into a night-long loud argument with my mother about how she was dumping her responsibilities as a mother on him when he was already having a hard enough time trying to be a father. I used to love it when he would tear into her that way. Partially it was because she deserved to be knocked off her high horse sometimes, but mainly it was because it meant he was done punishing me and I could go to bed where I would be free of the two of them until the morning. Except that night, I saw that dog, or dog man, outside my window again. He wasn't trying to poke his head in the house that time. He was off in the distance, trying to get behind our backyard shed. I figure a squirrel or a cat or some smaller animal was probably back there, and the dogman was trying to get at it. I remember, I got out of bed, walked over to the Venetian blinds in my room, and, as quietly as I could, I lowered them so that I could no longer see the dogman out there. Out of sight, out of mind. As I had said earlier, I tried to convince myself that the doctor was right, and that I had just dreamed the dogman encounters, both of them. It was better than my mother's view, which was that I was a liar and a bad boy. I knew I wasn't lying about it, but what if I had imagined or dreamed it? I know it doesn't explain how I banged the back of my head while watching Gigantor cartoons, but at least parts of the doctor's theory made sense, so I went with it. I don't remember what year this next part happened, but it had to have been before 9/11, because I was talking to my friend who I lost on that day. We were at the restaurant that was diagonally across from the southwest corner of Tompkins Square Park on Avenue A and 7th Street in New York City. My late friend was telling me that in the Midwest, they have real-life werewolves. I remember laughing and not believing it, but then he pulled out a magazine, possibly the 14 Times. There was an article in there about the Beast of Bray Road, and it captured my interest. I didn't connect the dogman in the article with what I had seen upstate as a kid until a few days later when I was telling my first girlfriend about it. She and I were going through one of our periods of talking to each other, which would always be sandwiched between periods where we wouldn't talk to each other. When I mentioned the Beast of Bray Road, she asked me if that wasn't just like the dream I had when I was a kid about the giant dog taller than the living room window whose belly I touched that day. She was right, it was just exactly like that. And so, I would like to say that I became a student of everything Dogman. I scoured the globe, and I grew into an expert on this particular cryptid. But, actually, I pretty much forgot about the entire thing until the virus thing hit earlier this year. I've been one of the lucky ones continuing to draw a full-time paycheck for a job I can now do in 2 hours a day since I can work from home without the constant, pointless interruptions from my attention-deprived boss. That leaves me an extra 6 hours per day to search the internet for entertainment. I think I've seen everything on Netflix, everything on Disney Plus, and I've watched all Bigfoot movies I can find on Amazon Prime, both the documentaries and the fiction films. I got Roku and I discovered Midnight Pulp, which I devoured in its entirety already. And in the middle of all that, I found a number of channels talking about the Dogman on YouTube. So it's really just in the past few months that I've become truly interested in the phenomenon. I've binge-watched the Skinwalker Ranch series because I heard that they had Dogman sightings on that ranch in the past. I'm really wondering what Dogman actually is. Is this an animal like a bear? Is this a nature spirit? Is this a shapeshifter like a werewolf or a skinwalker? What did I reach out and touch the belly of that night so many years ago? It felt real to me. It felt like the belly of a giant dog, which is what it looked like too. It didn't feel interdimensional, and when it bared its teeth at me, they didn't seem paranormal. It seemed like a very real animal, just one that I hadn't known existed. I don't think I had a supernatural experience, but a genuine one, on the day when I saw and touched the Dogman in the Venetian blinds. I come from the Dogman world. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I'm not going to tell you who I am because they would lock me up as an insane person, but I can answer any questions you have about Dogman. I can do this because I come from the Dogman world. Actually, I can only answer questions about what I know. I'm not a biologist or a veterinarian. I can't explain the Dogman's digestive system or anything like that, but I can answer most general questions about the creature. I know as much about the Dogman as most of you would know about bears. You probably aren't experts, but you would probably know what a bear is, and you've probably seen a number of them in your life, at the zoo, and on TV. Well, where I come from, we only have rumors about bears. They're basically cryptids where I come from, just as Dogman is here. We have Dogmen in our forests as you have bears, and we react in a similar way toward them. I would say that of the two, the Dogman is usually the more aggressive. I've heard some stories about grizzly bears that make them sound like they might be as dangerous as the Dogman sometimes, but the Dogman is more aggressive than any of the animals native to your reality. That's another thing I can't fully explain, but I came from another place. It was the same place as here, really, but different. I walked through our backyard, and things changed. They didn't change a lot, not at first, but I noticed that something was different than it had been a second earlier. It confused me, but I went about my morning chores and hoped it would begin to make sense in time. My mother was changed. Both my parents, really. They still did the same chores as before, but there was a subtle shift. My mother had somehow become the leader of the family, and my father now deferred to her decision-making. That was the reverse of the reality I had come from. Somehow, while walking through our backyard, I had left the place I was born in and entered this parallel world that is your home. I began to spend all my free time walking back and forth in the backyard. My parents, or at least this dimension's version of my parents, got worried about me. It's not normal for a teenager to walk back and forth creating a rut in the ground in the backyard. I couldn't tell them that I was doing it to try to escape their world and get away from them forever. That wouldn't just make them certain that I was bonkers, it would also hurt their feelings. I spent months exploring the property and looking for the doorway I had accidentally walked through that morning. There was one time when I heard a disembodied voice in the yard, and I ran toward where I thought it was coming from. It sounded just like myself, which was more than a little creepy. And I remember specifically what the voice said. It said, "This is just so illogical." Indeed. There are other things different about the two worlds, but most of them have melted into my mind to the point where I don't really remember how they used to be different any longer. The Dogman thing sticks out and is a big deal to me though. You guys have bears, but Dogman is a cryptid. I find this fascinating, so let's get into me trying to remember as much as I can about the Dogman. First of all, dogmen dislike other dogmen. There are exceptions such as family and mating couples, but generally speaking they despise each other. And they dislike the four-legged kinds of dogs too. If you suspect there is a dogman moving through your locality, it would be wise to bring Rover indoors at night for the duration. They are generally migratory, however, if there is plentiful food in one area, they may camp out and settle down. I remember reading a Sunday supplement article about this one dogman that had habituated near a Mormon community in Utah for over 30 years. When it started taking people's farm animals and pets, though, it was driven off the land and became migratory once again. Nobody exhibits dogman in the zoo in my reality. They're considered too close to human. Some of them have been captured by government and industry, but only for purposes of relocation away from human communities or for study. At least, that's the official word. I wouldn't be that surprised if some rich head of a corporation had a private zoo with a dogman in it, though. The dogman has certain habits and instincts that in this reality dogs don't usually have. They will play with their kills, for one thing, in a manner that only cats do in this version of Earth. They will climb up into trees and wait to pounce on prey in the way big cats here might do as well. Their behavior is not really very similar to the kinds of dogs you know, although obviously they bark and they howl just the same. It's almost as though they have similar machinery, but the cockpit is occupied by a completely different kind of pilot. I'm pretty certain that all of the dogmen that you guys see are from the place that I wish I could go back to. I wonder if I will ever go back there. I try to make myself happy or at least content to be here, but I can't get rid of the nagging feeling that I need to get out of here and that I'm running out of time. I wonder if my counterpart now in my world, who belongs here with you, feels the same stress that I do. I've been here in your reality 27 years now, and I was only in my real reality a bit over 18 years, so I guess I should realize this place has been my home longer than my real home ever had a chance to be, and yet this still feels like a prison, to be trapped here in Bear World. Here, the world I knew and loved is a myth, only glimpsed in flashes here and there by a select few. I should be there, breathing that air every single day. I was born for that world, not for this one. I don't want to be here any longer because I come from the Dogman world. We've got two all-new exciting Dogman stories for you today. But before we get started, I'm excited to say that today's executive producer is one of our favorites. I'm talking about none other than Matt Dwayne L. He might pronounce it Matt Lipaden because he's loved by all the maidens, or one might say Lipadan because we know that he's the man. Before this rhyme drives me insane, please join us as we thank Matt Dwayne. And if you would like to be remembered eternally like the great Matt Dwayne L., merely join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Either way, it gains you access to over 10 hours of archived, secret, uncensored, scary stories with a new one each Sunday night. Speaking of new stories, today's first story takes place in a location known for its urban squalor. It's known for crowded projects, rats, and crime. But this story took place in the late 1920s, when the Bronx was still largely unsettled country land. The Bronx River and its tributaries ran everywhere through the woods, making the northern borough of New York City an ideal place to set up farms. And so, the place we now associate mainly with paved, low-income city streets got settled by farmers from Germany looking to escape the bad economy there and the looming threat of the guy with the Chaplin mustache, whose name must not be mentioned on YouTube. And so we call this story The Immigrants and the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my grandparents came to America from Germany in the 1920s and established a small family farm in the Bronx. The area was only beginning to be settled and was still overrun with rabbit and deer and other game animals. Between farming and hunting, the family survived comfortably. Now remember, 1927 was the year that Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs, and he played in Yankee Stadium, which was also in the Bronx. I find it fascinating that when Babe Ruth played in that stadium, the Bronx was farmland. When Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio played, the government built high-rise, low-income projects there. When Reggie Jackson played, you could see the buildings past the outfield fence burning down as landlords hired arsonists to set insurance fires. Property in the Bronx by then was no longer worth a penny. They made a movie about the Bronx back then called Fort Apache the Bronx. Since then, they tore a lot of the high-rise apartments down and replaced them with single-family homes. Quite a different atmosphere there these days. If you're a werewolf movie fan, then you may have seen Wolfen, set in the South Bronx of the 70s. I invite you to look at Google Maps and check out the same area today. All the buildings in that movie are long gone, replaced by a suburban-looking neighborhood. If you haven't seen the movie, it's not a big spoiler to say that the supernatural wolves in the film are closely associated with the Native Americans who live in the area. The fictional natives sort of look to me like they're from the Wild West, not like the Native Americans I actually knew growing up in the Bronx, who were of South American and island descent, not Western. They were not descended from New York tribes, but had moved up north in the 20th century. So the movie was kind of a warped, twisted mirror version of the life I really was living there for a short while, before I miraculously got a grant and went off to college in the Midwest. During the time I was living in the Bronx, I knew two different guys in my high school who were both training to become shamans. Both of them told me that they had already shape-shifted, although they were still really in the process of discovering how to do it. Neither was willing to show me, so I never knew and still don't know for certain that they were being honest. I felt deeply that they were, though, because the world they described seemed far more complete and real to me than the world described to me by science or math or by what they preached in my church either. Rap music was more or less invented and started in the Bronx and northern Manhattan in the 1970s when I lived there. At least that's when the Sugar Hill Gang put out Rapper's Delight. Although most of the people I grew up with in the Bronx were pretty urban and modern, my grandfather was a throwback to the old days. He had spent his life in that house for 50 years, and he had seen it go from a farm on a dirt road to a house down the block from an urban shopping district that had garbage blowing down the street all day and night. We once saw a robbery on the corner just randomly and tried to give descriptions to the cops. The toughest kid we knew had his bike stolen. Nobody was safe, and it was a horrible way to live. I would go away on weekends upstate with one of my friends who was training to be a shaman. There would be a pig roast and plenty of food, pretty and friendly girls my age to hang out with. And at night, I would hear the wolves running around. My friend would tell me the next day that those weren't wolves, that they were him and his uncle transformed into wolf-like men. I wanted to believe him. Hell, I begged him to show me how to do it. I wanted to train to be a shaman too. He told me that if I had the calling, I would already have a teacher. I told him that he was my teacher, but he scoffed. So I remained outside of that world, looking in, wanting in, but never being invited in. I knew just enough about it, though, that it colored how I interpreted my grandfather's story when he told me about the dogman that once lived across the street. I forget when he said this took place exactly, but I think around the 1940s? Maybe it was the 1930s, although that would have been the Great Depression. At any rate, some point after his farm and family had lived there for years, someone bought the grove of trees across the dirt path they lived on, put in a paved road that crossed theirs, and built a block of brick-and-mortar stores across the way. It was the beginning of the end of the peaceful ways of that place, but it was welcome at the time. No longer would they have to travel so far for supplies, as a hardware store soon opened on that newly paved block. Convenience was coming to the neighborhood. Soon, eggs and chicken were available up the block for cheaper than it cost to raise them yourself. Soon, all the hunting land was being paved over and built on. So, Grandpa went and got himself a job in a factory so that he could buy his family eggs up the block that he couldn't afford to raise himself any longer. It was during that transition period that this dogman sighting took place. The way the stores were built on the new block that intersected theirs, the back entrance of one of the stores was directly across from the front door of the farm. There was a driveway built there for some reason on an angle heading down under the street level, and the cars would have to park at that fairly steep angle, nose facing down, toward a door that led into the basement of the store. Why it was built that way, I don't know, but it was such a dumb idea to do it that way that the driveway fell into disuse almost immediately. Within 10 years, it had become overgrown with tall weeds and trees that big Bronx rats liked to scamper and play inside. Soon, the block that Grandpa lived on had become more populated as different families bought plots and built houses on them. Every house had a different style of home on it, no two alike, as all of them had been built at different times, independently of each other. The first event that started to bring the families together and make them into a neighborhood in the true sense was the growing concern about the rat's nest they were living across the street from. At first, they demanded the store owners clean up the property, but the store owners insisted they were just renters and that the landlord should do it. The landlord insisted they had no obligation to do cleanup, but they granted permission to the neighbors who wanted to clear-cut the tiny jungle on their own time. The company said they wouldn't charge them with trespassing and would forgive the crime. What big hearts! So Grandpa and the others on the block banded together one day to cut down all the weeds, leave a few of the trees, and rid the neighborhood of the rat infestation. They chose a Saturday morning, then began the horrible cleanup job. According to the way my grandpa told me this when I was very small, the cement had cracked, and trees and weeds had grown up through the cracks. Those same cracks were used by the rats to burrow down underground and live there in the weird, deeply cut former driveway. He said some of the holes had been made by the rats, others had been made by the plants. They worked together to tear down the civilization around them and infest the place with their vermin selves. Grandpa said they were a good halfway through the jungle, hacking it down with big knives and restoring human control over that patch of land, when he nearly brought his big shovel down on something that he thought was a large rat. When it moved, he saw that it was as big as he was, but laying on the ground, hoping not to be seen. Recoiling in horror, my grandfather told me he ordered whoever that was to stand up. But when he did, what my grandfather saw was so surprising that he dropped everything he was holding in shock. The person hiding down there hadn't been a person at all. It was a furry, gray dog thing that stood on its hind legs and barked at them all furiously. The Hispanic man on the block fell to his knees saying prayers in another language. Everyone there, each of them of a different national descent, each of them having been raised in a different culture, all agreed on what they were seeing. This was an animal man. It was not a normal animal. It was a transformed or cursed being. It was a shapeshifter. My grandfather cited werewolf legends and thought the man was cursed with lycanthropy. The people of other cultures had different interpretations of why this man had become half canine. But none of them, I repeat, nobody on the block, interpreted this as just a beast. I wanted to know what happened to the werewolf or dog man. I wanted to know if they captured him or what they did. Grandpa insisted that the neighbors backed off and that the dog man left. But what did that mean, he left? It was supposed to be the morning. It would have been bright out. Did the dog man just stroll away down the block and go have breakfast at a diner? Like, how does a man-sized dog man escape a crowd of neighbors on a bright Saturday morning? Grandpa grew impatient when I would quiz him about that part of the story. He said it dove back into the woods and disappeared, but they had already torn down half of the little jungle before discovering the werewolf creature. Because of my experiences with my friends who were training to learn shamanism, I kind of believed the story. I just felt that something was left out of the end of it. Did the werewolf transform back to human in front of them in order to stop them from executing him as a monster? Was it one of their neighbors? Was it someone they knew? Was it someone I knew? Was that why he didn't want me to know the full story? My grandfather passed on when I was only 10, so I only had a short period to talk to him about this, and I only had a kid's mind to formulate the questions with. I sure wish I could have just one more conversation with that fascinating old man. I wish I had just one more chance to ask him about the immigrants and the dog man in the butcher shop. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I grew up believing in werewolves and dog-headed monsters because my father lost the tip of one of his pinkies to a dog man. Well, at least, sort of. I've got a story my father told me happened to him when he and my mother were first married, back before I was born. He was working in a butcher shop at the time, which was located at the edge of town on this one short block. It was the only store on the block, so the butcher had added other businesses in addition to being a butcher. This way it would be more of a necessary destination. He would cash checks for the locals. He sold candy to the kids. And he had a rack of paperbacks and magazines that people could read while he chopped up their meat for them. If he hadn't provided these extra services as well as top quality meat, then most people would have just gone to the new supermarket that had opened nearby. It was more convenient, and you could get more of your shopping done at one time. My father was the assistant butcher, so he was trained to handle all these different kinds of things, cashing checks and so forth, in addition to learning the trade of butchering meat. The owner became comfortable enough with my father that he eventually assigned him to work Saturdays at the butcher shop all by himself. Now, you have to picture the way this little shop was situated. The block it was on was so short because the two streets on either side were not parallel to each other. Instead, they started further apart and then came closer together. This is the kind of thing that can happen when an area is settled gradually over a century or longer instead of being planned all at once. So the butcher shop looked out on the forest at the edge of town. There was literally nothing across the street except trees. People would still travel over to the edge of the town to get their meat though, because my father and his boss provided top service. However, they were doing it less and less, settling for the supermarket meat more and more often, because it was just so much easier to do your shopping in town and all at once. So, one Saturday evening, the store had been empty nearly all day, and Dad was just waiting for 6 o'clock to come around so he could close the shop and go home. Now, in the story, He points out that the sun was going down earlier by that time, so this had to have happened in late summer, maybe, possibly autumn. I don't think it was winter, because he gave me the impression that the forest hid the presence of the creature from him at first. Bare branches of trees in winter wouldn't provide cover for a monster, so this had to be late summer or else autumn. Still, for the sun to already be going down at 6, that makes it sound like deep winter. Maybe the store closed at 7 or 8 then, and maybe I'm remembering that part wrong. The main point is that it was getting dark. It wasn't quite time to close. And then, as Dad gazed out onto the woods across the street, something big, hairy, and impossible marched right out of those trees on its hind legs and walked over toward the butcher shop like it was angry. My father told me the thing glared at him with eyes that reflected back light in a way no man's eyes could ever do. He said it marched right across the street, glaring at him as though my father had just said something insulting about the dogman's mom. Dad got so scared watching him coming that he ran to the back and locked himself inside the meat locker. There was a little tiny window in the meat freezer door, so Dad watched and saw bits of the dogman tearing the butcher shop apart. He ravenously ate all the meat that was out there on display in the refrigerated case. Then he made his way back to the meat locker, beating hard on the door. The dogman seemed to be trying to break the freezer door down. Dad told me there was no way to lock the freezer from the inside, so he was pushing back on that door as hard as he could. The dogman didn't seem smart enough to understand that he just needed to lean down on the lever to open the door. But Dad felt that sooner or later, the wildly flailing monster would open that door just by accident. That's not what happened. What did happen was that the monster accidentally flipped the lock. It locked my father in the meat freezer. Then, the dogman gave up and left. When Dad didn't show up for dinner that night, my mother got on the phone with the butcher who owned the shop. Together, they went to the store and discovered the entire place trashed, with my father nowhere to be seen. That neighborhood was so desolate in those days that nobody else had even noticed what had happened when they arrived. They almost left the property when the owner decided to check to make sure the contents of the freezer were still intact. Inside, he found my father unconscious and frostbitten. The two of them rushed him to the owner's home to warm him up. Back then, they would bring sick people home, then get a doctor to make a house call. It wasn't like now with emergency rooms and all of that. My father lost the tip of one of his pinkies to that frostbite, and that was usually the conversation piece that would prompt his retelling of this dogman story. I grew up believing in werewolves. If they weren't real, my father would never have gotten frostbite from the dogman in the butcher shop.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
come back for more scary stories.